Hi, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're joining us from in the world. My name is Gabi Kirk. Welcome to our Jadaliya Environment Page Arab Studies Institute first ever webinar, The World is Burning, Fire and Climate Crisis from the Mediterranean to the US West Coast. We are hanging here for just a few moments while we get the live stream calibrated. We are on Zoom and we're live streaming on Facebook, and I'm seeing our participant numbers come up. So I just really want to thank everyone for being here today with us to talk about this very important related topics. There's actually many topics that are intersecting in this webinar. And so we're really excited for you all to be here today to join us. So we're just going to hang for a minute while we get the Facebook live stream going and while we let participants join us and log in as everything happens. It'll happen. So thank you again for joining us for the Jadaliya Environment Page and Arab Studies Institute live webinar on The World is Burning, Fire and Climate Crisis from the Mediterranean to the US West Coast. So we will start our panel as soon as our Facebook live stream is streaming. We are live, amazing. So thank you all so much for being here today for our first ever, as I said, Jadaliya Environment Page webinar. Again, my name is Gabi Kirk, and I'll be moderating today's conversation, The World is Burning, Fire and Climate Crisis from the Mediterranean to the US West Coast. I'd first like to sincerely thank our three panelists for taking the time to be here today. It's really wonderful to hear from them, friends new and old, and so we're just so grateful for all of you to be here. And I'd love to thank everyone at the Arab Studies Institute and the Jadaliya team for all their work behind the scenes to make this happen. Graham Pitts, Owen Lawson, and the rest of our Environment Page editorial team, MK Smith, Kylie Broderick, and Bassam Haddad at Arab Studies Institute Jadaliya for just all of their stalwart support, particularly MK Smith for her tech support. Please tune in to the ongoing Arab Studies Institute or ASI programs, including the new monthly ASI live broadcast, where if you can't keep up with everything going on, we will share with you highlights. You can learn more by following Jadaliya on Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter. So we're gonna go ahead and get started with the conversation we're having today. Unprecedented waves of wildfires are remaking landscapes, politics, and communities globally. For many, these fires stress that the politics of the climate crisis are no longer the concern of a few, but urgent questions for all. But what precisely are the connections between climate and fires, and can we disentangle these connections from other causes and other issues? Today, we bring together scholars of Lebanon, Palestine, North Africa, global arid lands, and California. And our panelists will reflect on issues that include but are not limited to the local and transnational ramifications of forest management and wildfires, issues around burning practices, property regimes, and techniques of environmental control and science and power in the context of the climate crisis. On a personal note, today's panel feels particularly important to me, as it has been almost 8 weeks of constant burning in my home in Northern California. I'm calling you today from Oakland. So far this year, it is estimated that over 3.7 million acres have burned across California, a record-setting year, in addition to massive wildfires in Oregon. Smoke from these fires has been seen to affect air quality as far away as the Netherlands. In addition to the 40 lives lost directly from fire this year on the West Coast, between August 1st and September 10th, the historically bad concentrations of wildfire smoke may have been responsible for at least 1,200 and possibly up to 3,000 premature deaths in California that otherwise would not have occurred, according to pre-peer review research from Stanford researchers Marshall Burke and Sam Hefneel. And it's very relevant because just last night the smoke started blowing in again, and we're up to 120 AQI and our windows are sealed shut. I won't be going outside for days. In the midst of an already catastrophic and catastrophically managed global pandemic affecting respiratory systems, the impact of wildfires on human and environmental health is almost too much to comprehend. Yet, as a scholar and activist who has been working on issues connecting California and Palestine for a decade, it's also been difficult for me to see both places in the news surrounded by misinformation and fear. From the linking of fire in Lebanon, Palestine, and throughout the Mediterranean with racialized notions of terrorism, to misinformation about California's fires, many of which are not in forests at all, which lead to worsening land management practices, there is still much to learn and teach about fires, climate crisis, and links to capitalism and colonialism. I'm very grateful for our panelists today to be here to help with this important educational effort. And I'm going to introduce the three panelists now, and then we'll move into a few questions I will ask. And we'll open up the conversation after that for questions from our viewers. In the meantime, if you have any questions, you can use the Q&A function on Zoom chat, or if you're watching on Facebook Live, leave a comment and our team will catch it. So I'm gonna start with Zena. Zena Agha is a Palestinian Iraqi writer from London. She is a non-resident scholar at the Middle East Institute and previously served as the U.S. Policies Fellow for Al-Shabaka, the Palestinian Policy Network based in New York. Her areas of expertise include climate change and Palestinian adaptive capacities, British and Zionist colonial cartography, satellite imagery over Palestine, Israel, and Israeli spatial practices. So thank you, Zena. Diana K. Davis, a geographer and veterinarian, is professor of geography and history at the University of California, Davis. Her most recent book is The Arid Lands, History, Power, and Knowledge, and her first book, Resurrecting the Granary of Rome, Environmental History and French Colonial Expansion in North Africa, was awarded 3 book prizes in geography and history. So thank you so much, Diana, for being here today. Salma Talhouk is a professor of landscape horticulture in the Department of Landscape Design and Ecosystem Management in the Faculty of Agriculture and Food Sciences at the American University of Beirut in Lebanon. Her focus is on community stewardship of natural resources, digital technology and nature conservation, and cultural ecosystem services. She has published over 50 peer-reviewed articles and produced more than 30 short documentaries on local green initiatives in Lebanon. And Talhouk is the founder of the AUB Nature Conservation Center and founder and chair of the AUB Botanic Garden. So thank you all so much for being here today. We're gonna start with our first question, and we'll start with Diana as our first respondent, and then Zena, and then Salma. So would you introduce our audience to your personal experience with or research on historical or present wildfires? Diana, please take us away.
All right. Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us. And before I begin with the question, I just have to say, and I'm sure I speak for all the panelists, thank you to the organizers, Gabi, especially you, but all of you, Arab Studies Institute, and of course, Jadaliyya. This is a really important topic, and I'm just very happy to be part of it. To open on a personal note, I have 2 sons, and one of them has been living, for you Harry Potter fans, in the cabinet under the stairs. The combination of the pandemic and the wildfire smoke has meant no one can go outside for any reason, and we're all getting on each other's nerves, and so that's been his way of coping. I was born in the high desert of Albuquerque, New Mexico, which is sort of a privileged environment. There's really no earthquakes, there's no tornadoes, there's no wildfires. So I had no personal experience with these kinds of environmental disasters until well into my adult years. But for the past 3 to 5 years, we've had devastating mega fires that have formed a ring really around where I live in Davis, ranging between 50 and 100 miles from my house. Today, the closest one is about 50 miles directly west. Another one that's almost 1 million acres now is 75 miles to the northwest. Anyway, I could go on, but you get the picture. So that's my personal experience, is living with being always ready to evacuate and this horrible smoke. But fire first came to my attention during my doctoral research on North Africa. And it was very interesting and surprising to me to learn just how much the local indigenous populations from Algeria to Tunisia to Morocco used fire, particularly herders who were grazing livestock and small farmers. And why did they use it? They used it to prepare fields, burning agricultural fields, the stubble to prepare for planting, releases a fertilizing ash, and it also kills a lot of weedy seeds and insects that might impact negatively the agricultural yield. So burning fields is a very common thing among small farmers. However, fire can also be used in a very controlled way to regenerate pastures, grass and other types of pastures, for many different kinds of livestock. So this was also a common use of fire before the colonial period and in the early colonial period. However, it was completely misunderstood by the colonial powers for the most part. There are a couple of exceptions. But the apparatus of the colonial state in North Africa didn't understand fire, saw it as, a bad thing, a very bad thing, and that people did it for bad reasons. And so they, of course, suppressed it, just like they suppressed grazing and nomadism in general. And this led, of course, just like it did here in California, to a whole bunch of buildup of fuels. And they actually had many catastrophic fires, especially in Algeria during the colonial period, that were related, at least in part, to fire suppression and grazing suppression. And I'm going to come back and talk about this a little bit more later, but it's very important to understand, from my point of view, that the colonial powers, and not just the French, but the British and several other colonial powers, went to their territories carrying an ideological bias, we could call it, this lens of fire being bad and fire suppression being the best way to proceed with many different landscapes. And this was based in something I have come to call arborocentrism, which is a tree-centric way of looking at the world. And looking at the long history of how this developed in Europe, which I've been doing lately, is quite interesting. And I might have time a little later to share some of that with you. But it is like the tentacles on an octopus. This kind of bias, this arborocentrism, gets into our brains and affects in many different ways the way we manage the environment and the way we think about environmental management. So I've gone over 4 minutes, so I'm going to stop and allow my panelists to take up the question. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Diana. Zena?
Yeah, thank you very much. And thanks everyone for joining us on whatever time of day it is that you are checking in with this. So I suppose my research is a little different. My research is primarily on Palestine and climate change, particularly Palestinian adaptive capabilities, as Gabi mentioned in the introduction, and the limitations of the Israeli occupation, which has been going on for over 5 decades now. So during my tenure as the US Policy Fellow for Shabaka, I focused a lot of my research on climate change in Palestine, Israel, and particularly the effects of Israeli and Palestinian Authority policy towards climate change. And I set out to examine it because I felt there was a bit of a blind spot in a lot of the research that was happening. You know, Palestine is now moving its axis towards being understood as a progressive issue in the West. But that it still wasn't embraced as an environmental issue. And so I was hoping to be able to sort of bridge these two progressive causes very tangibly and very clearly between them, because the discourses had been quite separate, I felt. So, you know, as for fires specifically, I mean, I think I've been looking at fires only insofar as a fallout of climate breakdown and climate collapse. Of course, we all know that the increased risk of there's an increased risk of forest fires with the onset of climate breakdown and climate collapse, and it represents another aspect of climate breakdown in a really vulnerable region. Just to give you a quick overview of what we expect to happen in Palestine, Israel as the territory, but also just the wider Mediterranean and region. There'll be warmer temperatures, so it'll just be hotter. That it'll be very difficult to keep temperatures in check, and a decrease in rainfall. So it'll be warmer, but there won't be much rain. And just to give you a sense of how severe this is expected to be, in the region will be up by 30% if we were to compare it to the last 50 years. And over the last 4 decades, the average temperatures have already increased about 0.5 degree Celsius. So what this means is that for this century, for the 21st century, we anticipate a temperature increase of between 2.2 and 5.1 degrees Celsius, which is staggering. And it'll lead to, very disruptive, if not utterly catastrophic changes to the region's climate, which includes increased desertification in an already very arid region. And the results of all of this, are the kind of messaging that we're hearing increasingly, all over the world. Streams are going to go dry. There'll be more forest fires, more invasive species, and increased risk of disease outbreak, both infectious and vector-borne. The cost of agriculture is going to rise because of crop deterioration. There'll be increased pest spread, damage from storms, from floods, from droughts. And of course, in the case of Palestine, Israel, the political context is only going to exacerbate that. And I'll talk about that a little later on. But I think I wanted to indicate the way in which we understand climate change as almost quite apolitical or scientific phenomenon, and actually that eclipses a political discourse. And that's something that it's a political that has brought me to understand this subject matter.
Thank you so much, Zena. Salma?
Okay, so it's interesting because my contribution to this seminar comes from completely different background. So for me, the forest fires, the way I look at them within the context of the relation between people and nature, and the loss of this relation. And when I talk about relation, I'm not talking only about the traditional practices and rural management, but I'm talking an overall disconnect from people with nature. And with this climate change issue, what is happening is that people are completely thrown off. They almost feel like they are alien in what is happening. And so they do realize that the weather pattern is changing. They do realize that it's getting hotter, but at the same time, they are not doing what they should be doing, or they don't know what to do to deal with this issue. And so my interest, even though my background is in basic science, I have shifted because really what I think the most important thing is, at least in countries, small countries such as Lebanon, is understanding what people see and what people think and what people perceive. And we are at a time now when nature is for hiking. And that's, there are very limited values that are perceived for nature. Of course, in the case of Lebanon, we have the cedars of Lebanon. So the only response that people have, they struggle, they are frustrated, and the only response they have is every time there is a fire, they plant trees. And it's almost, you feel like people are like hamsters running in a wheel because they don't really know what to do. They have no connection with nature and the environment. And I tend to not think that we should talk about forests, but I think we should talk about nature. Because once you say forest, it becomes this green cover with no identity, with no dynamic, where in reality, especially in dry areas such as Lebanon, it's not only forests that burn, it's grasslands and woodlands and degraded areas, etc. So it's all the open and green spaces. So my research interest is to understand how can we reestablish some kind of relation and of uh, management of everyday nature, which is not based only on the scientific management by a few, but an ownership of all this nature surrounding us, and how can we deal with climate change. And I want to point here is that climate change is happening and the long-term prospects are terrible, but urban destruction and pollution and waste in Lebanon is destroying nature even faster than climate change. So we are really living the consequences of all our neglect and our disconnection.
Thank you all so much for those powerful words. We'll start with Zena for the next question. And again, if anyone has questions, we have a couple more for the panel. You can use the Q&A feature at the bottom of Zoom or the chat feature, or if you're watching on Facebook Live, you can just leave a comment under the stream. So Zena, we'll start with you, and then we'll go to Diana and then Salma. What do people often get wrong about how climate change, fires, or forests work in the region you study? So I know you'll talk broadly about what do people get wrong about climate change in Palestine.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think there's this perception that climate change is somehow divorced or separated from the political, social, and economic issues in Palestine today. Both Israeli, Palestinian, and UN reports of climate change have almost entirely ignored climate change's role as this threat multiplier in the Palestine-Israel issue. You know, there's lots of research going on that shows that the Israeli-Palestinian issue has made and will make the impacts of climate change infinitely more severe. Specifically, of course, the Israeli military occupation, which has already exacerbated climate-related resource shortages for Palestinians in the West Bank, Jerusalem, Gaza, and the occupied Syrian Golan Heights. So you have this bizarre paradox where even though climate change, as like forest fires are a perfect example, are indiscriminate in the way that it treats territory and land, the human effects of policy essentially mean that Israelis and Palestinians will experience the effects of climate change in hugely disproportionate ways. You know, the Israeli government presides over a very elaborate and stratified system of rights and access. You know, I think it's important to understand that climate outcomes in Palestine are an intentional structural set of policies. It's not an accidental byproduct. So, you know, when the time comes that climate change really bites, it'll be, you know, exacerbated and multiplied by the pre-existing inequalities already set up in place by ideological actors. And another big misunderstanding about climate change in Palestine, Israel, no doubt relates to Israel's perception as a leader in green governance. Israel has this very Janus-faced approach where on the one hand it sort of promotes environmental reform and green technologies. On the other, it steals Palestinian land and water. It deprives Palestinian of access to their land and to their natural resources, and so on and so forth. And so actually identifying this intrinsically contradictory approach by the Israeli government, I think, is paramount in establishing the discourse around climate change in Palestine, Israel. And just, you know, by way of example of what this means, if we take the case of water, according to the Oslo Accords, which were signed in the early and mid-90s, 80% of Palestinian water in the joint water aquifers are designed solely for Israeli use. And so actually, let alone all of the transgressions that Israel makes, even by Palestinian, you know, what is legally considered acceptable, which was the Oslo Accords were signed, 80% of Palestine's water gets taken by the Israeli regime. And then, of course, you know, Israeli settlers use up about 6 times more water than Palestinians living in the West Bank, according to Talhouk, which is a very excellent Palestinian human rights organization. And bearing in mind that settlers are only about 600,000, not only, so it's a huge figure, but 600,000 Israeli settlers live beyond the Green Line approximately, in comparison to almost 3 million Palestinian residents, just to give you a sense of that contrast. And then to add to that, there's a very complicated and elaborate system of permitting and committees. And, you know, the most prominent example of this is the Joint Water Committee. And they have a long track record of confiscating equipment, denying permits, making problems for licensing, all to prevent Palestinians from establishing any kind of water infrastructure. So actually, you know, one of the, you know, going back to this concept of misconceptions, is what we're seeing is a very, what goes on the public facing part of Israeli policy towards climate change and its sort of image globally around adaptation and mitigation, and then of course what it does in its own backyard and what it does to Palestinians insofar as establishing a very regimented, deliberate system of denial of resources and access.
Thank you, Zena. Diana?
Okay, first of all, wow, I'm learning so much from my panelists. Thank you. The image of Lebanese being on a hamster wheel planting forests after every fire in Lebanon is, I'm going to have to quote you on that, Salma. And I want to point out that I'm a scholar of dry lands, so deserts, arid lands, semi-arid lands, and the Mediterranean region. And it's interesting that the title of our panel today is From the Mediterranean to the West Coast, because the West Coast is a Mediterranean, well, at least in California, is a Mediterranean region. And I'd like to say that a lot of the things we're talking about would apply broadly over Southern Europe, North Africa, of course the Levant, and Australia. And these areas have seen some of the biggest catastrophic fires in recent years. You can think back to the firestorm in Australia. Was that last year or 2 years ago? I can't quite remember.
Actually, it was 2020. It was this year.
Oh my God. See, my concept of time, it's one catastrophe after another. My brain can't keep up. But I want to point out that in the dry lands and in the Mediterranean zones, I just want to get out there for everyone listening that one of the main effects of climate change in terms of vegetation change and fire hazard is the dry season, which is normally long in a Mediterranean climate, right? The winter comes in, the rain comes in the winter, but the dry season is longer, the rainy season is shorter, and the summer temperatures are higher, and the relative humidity, the dew points, tend to be lower. So all of that leads to the vegetation drying out longer and longer between each rainy season, which of course increases the fire hazard. So I just wanted to point that out. Another thing I want to point out is that tree plantations, and especially the kinds of trees that tend to be able to survive in the dry lands, like eucalyptus is one good example, they tend to soak up so much groundwater that if you plant tree plantations in the dry lands in the name of climate change, for example, or environmental amelioration, it has now been documented with reams of scientific studies that in these environments where trees often don't naturally grow, when you go and put in plantations, you can cause all sorts of problems, including desiccation of the soils, lowered agricultural yields because the trees are taking so much soil moisture, decreases in biodiversity, disruptions of the hydrological cycle, disruptions in the nutrient cycling in the soil. You can create something called green deserts in these monocrop stands of tree plantations, and it might be interesting for the people listening to this panel to know that, as far as I know, that term, the green desert, was coined by some Israeli ecologists studying Israeli forests, plantation forests of monocrop. I think it was Mediterranean pine tree. I'd have to look that up. But anyway, that is actually a term. A new term has been developed called underground deserts, because these plantations can soak up so much soil moisture that it depletes the soil moisture quite deep. So I just wanted to get that out there into our discussion because it's really important for thinking about trees as climate mitigation. So back to California where I live, and this is also true in most of the Mediterranean regions that we're talking about today, fire suppression has finally become widely known and accepted as a severe problem. So fire suppression in the case of California, over the course of a century has led, of course, to a buildup of the fuel load and is helping to create these mega fires. But what people often get wrong about this situation in California, and I believe in many other Mediterranean zones, is that grazing suppression or grazing elimination is actually a bigger problem in some areas. because that allows for a further buildup of the fuel load, both in forested and non-forested lands. Another thing that people often get wrong, and we're dealing with right now in California, because after all, the fires right now in Napa and Sonoma are burning in areas that have burned as recently as a month ago, but also as recently as 2 and 3 years ago. The area of Paradise, California, where the mega fire was in 2018 that killed, I think, 85 people, had burned 13 times in the past 20 years. Why is that? Because post-fire management is really important in these dryland Mediterranean zones. If you don't manage post-fire, you get something called brush invasion. Firemen will sometimes call this fire bush. The soil is so damaged in these mega fires that the only thing that can come back in the first wave of succession is often these kinds of invasive scrub brushes, plants that are highly prone to fire. What is the best known way to manage that? Heavy grazing. Heavy grazing of the scrub brush to prevent fire load or fuel load that increases fire hazard and allows the soil to recover and allows the other successions of plants like grasses and other things, native plants, to hopefully come back. So that is a really big problem. The other thing I want to point out for those people interested in California is that 57% of the forests in California are owned and controlled by the federal government. That is the U.S. government, not the state of California, so the U.S. Forest Service. So that makes California state innovations sometimes very difficult to carry out on nearly 60% of our forests. People are beginning to realize that, so they just signed a $1 billion California federal government agreement for shared stewardship of forests in order to try to lower fire hazard. But the sad thing for me is it only mentions grazing once and in a rather vague way. And I think we need to realize that at least part of the problem there is that there's a long history of not only fire suppression but grazing suppression in the U.S. Forest Service. And grazing leases on forest land in California have been reduced precipitously over the past few decades. So there's less and less grazing in the forests at the same time that there's fire suppression. So this is something that is not often understood. We're keeping our best firemen in the barn in California, and we need to let those ruminants out and let them eat away part of our problem. All right, I think I may have gone over 5 minutes. Sorry.
That's okay. That's a great point to end on. Salma, would you like to share some of the things people get wrong?
Yes, I'm going to pick up where some points that Diana raised that are, I don't know if they are misconceptions, but they were decisions taken at the time when maybe those decisions were right. And so I would say in the past, there were attempts at protecting the forests from wood cutting and destruction. And you know also there is this, when you have a private land and if you are not allowed to cut trees, then what you do, you burn it, you burn down the trees, and then you can recover your land and then you can build on it. So there were regulations that protected the forest from any wood cutting whatsoever to prevent those excuses. But this is no longer working because what happened is now we have large areas that are completely untouched and completely vulnerable to fires. This is not a resilient nature. This is a regrowth from abandoned agricultural lands. These are forests that are very dense, very low in biodiversity. On the coast, for example, we have mostly pine woodlands, and pine is not the natural vegetation on the Lebanese coast. And so the problem you have is a low diversity, highly flammable species in the proximity of cities that are expanding, abandoned agricultural lands, abandoned lots. And so there is, I think, abandonment is a major problem. And again, as Diana said, the other thing is related to grazing. Now, grazing, if it's done properly, it definitely will reduce significantly the incidence of fire. But when in Lebanon, for example, we have highly degraded lands, and unless you can come up with a mechanism to really control grazing. And this happens in many municipalities where there are contracts and agreements of places where grazing should occur and places where grazing should be avoided. So this is why when I started, I said it's really a disconnect from managing and using nature and biodiversity. Because in the past, even grazing was negotiated, and there were rotations, and there was an understanding of what the land would provide and when it should be left to rest. And all of this understanding is gone. And so all we see now is forests and trees. We don't see the dynamic, we don't see the diversity, we don't see the other resources that we can extract from these forests. So I would say the two important issues is that people think that they should leave nature alone, that they should leave forest alone, which cannot happen in densely populated areas. And the other misconception is that it has double meaning. Grazing on one side will prevent regeneration, but also it will prevent fires. And so it has to be reconsidered as a tool, as a cheap and ecologically friendly tool to reduce fire hazard in woodland.
Thank you all so much. We'll move into the last, pre-planned question. And again, I would love to remind all of our viewers, we're going to have some time for questions from you in just a few minutes. So please go ahead. You can use the Q&A function at the bottom of Zoom. You can leave a question in the Zoom chat, or you can leave a comment on the Facebook live stream, and we will get to it. So our last question, we've all talked today about the increasing prevalence of major wildfires around the world. So what does this kind of issue today tell us about connections between any of these issues, climate change, natural resource management, and then particularly though the questions of colonialism, settler colonialism, or capitalism and private property, AKA what are the kind of political and ecological connections that wildfire really tells us today? Thanks. And we'll go ahead and start with Diana for that one, and then Salma, and then Zena will finish out.
Oh, okay. Sorry, I didn't know I was going to go first. I got to set my timer. I'll go over. Oh no, it's broken. Gabi, can you time me?
Yes, I can time you. You want 5? Yeah.
Yeah, 5 or 6 minutes, maybe at the most. I have a lot to say on this. Excuse me. The first thing I'd like to say is that I love trees. Okay, trees are good. I planted a eucalyptus and a cork oak on my property here in California within the first year that I moved in. Planting trees are wonderful in many environments, but they're not good everywhere. George Perkins Marsh was wrong in that respect. I also want to just get out there for everyone to think about that grazing and herding is a very skilled activity. And it used to be a widespread indigenous knowledge that was, of course, suppressed and in some cases lost because of colonialism. And if we're going to bring back grazing today, we need grazing and herding schools, because grazing has to be managed. Just free-range grazing can actually do a lot of damage in many different environments. So I'm not just advocating, goats everywhere. I want to get that out there. But I want to come back to arborocentrism for my portion of this question, because this is an environmental ideology that is driven by privileging trees as the best vegetation. It has a really long history that I can't go into, but I do want to say that it was widespread during the colonial period. I believe it began in Algeria in the 1870s when the concept of the taux de boisement, which is the rate of forest cover, was first actually quantified. It had been talked about a lot. But what happened is during the colonial period, a lot of European actors went to foreign places. They found environments that were strange to them. They looked defective because they didn't look like home. And this kind of, environmental Orientalism sort of developed that said, oh, well, this doesn't look right, so we need to change these environments. We need to make them civilized. And so the idea of civilization, which of course most of the colonial actors thought was at home in Europe, which had about a 30 to 35% average taux de boisement, or rate of forest cover, that became the norm. And this became institutionalized in forest schools, like the forest school at Nancy in the 19th century. It spread through throughout the British colonial service, and there's even some French scholars who have written on this about how widely spread it became. And by 1925, believing that you needed about a 30% taux de boisement anywhere for civilization was dogma throughout the colonial world. So equating proper forest cover, about 25, 35, sometimes up to a little higher than that, of forest cover with civilization was something that came out of the colonial period that is still haunting us today. And what goes hand in hand with this is a complete misunderstanding of the drylands and the Mediterranean zones. And today, this misunderstanding is not by scientists. We have reams of scientific data showing, how these drylands work, and that it's not always a good idea to plant trees. But it's still not gotten through to the general public and to the politicians and to the planners. So what are some of the takeaways? What are some of the results of this? Well, when we're talking about climate change, the Trillion Tree Campaign, right? There was a big study, if we just plant 1 trillion trees in every space on the planet where they might grow, we can solve climate change. So this idea is carbon sequestration with plantations. But this is a huge problem. Now, I've already explained some of the problems with planting trees in the dryland areas, but there are other issues at stake. Misunderstood completely in this narrative, this arborocentric environmental sort of ideology, is that grasslands are our friends. Grasslands are natural biomes throughout the world. We can have thick grasslands, thin grasslands, there's many different kinds of grasslands. But what's been shown, at least here in California, with very precise documented research, is that grasslands are better and more reliable carbon sinks. Most of the carbon in grasslands is stored below ground. Grasses are highly resilient to fire and also to drought and aridity. Therefore, if they burn, they release much less of the carbon that they have stored. If a forest burns, the vast majority of the carbon stored in those forests is released, and in addition to forming particulate air pollution, there you go, all that carbon is up in there. And Gabi specifically asked about, or maybe all of you who organize, colonialism, capitalism, and private property. And so maybe we can talk about this more in the discussion, but I think it's worth saying that non-equilibrial dynamics govern many ecosystems in the drylands and in the Mediterranean zone. Not all of them. I could show you a map if I had one available for you. I can point you to one later if you're interested. But in those non-equilibrium ecological systems, the idea of private property can become quite problematic. Why? Because these are highly unreliable, unpredictable environments. It rains some years, and then it might not rain for years on end. And this is a natural part of the ecosystem. Therefore, in these non-equilibrial ecosystems, mobility is crucial. We can think of mobility in the form of pastoral nomadism. Nomads tend to move from place to place following the rains because that's where the grass will grow. This kind of mobility has not often been compatible with capitalism, which wants a reliable source of profit. Tree plantations for timber production is a reliable source of profit. And a lot of the climate mitigation programs that involve plantations are actually carbon offset projects. And so a carbon emitter can pay to have plantations planted somewhere in the global south to offset their carbon. And this has been talked about in the geography literature as a form of carbon colonialism. And I think all of this bears thinking about with these bigger questions of climate change and fire and how we can better manage our environments for a more sustainable future. And I'm sure I've gone over. Have I?
No, you're pretty much right at time. I was about to call on you. So thank you so much,
good.
Diana.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Salma?
So I think the issue that may be aggravating our attention to our immediate nature and our environment may be related also to the global characterization of what is a valuable nature. So, for example, you say there are forests, and so people assume that if you have forests, then this is where the nature is worth it, and then everything else is a non-nature. It's just wasted lands. And this is very dangerous because this is where the abandonment and the neglect start. And I'm going to give you a small anecdote that shows how important how difficult it becomes to care about a Mediterranean nature when in your image as a local person, the ultimate nature is a lush and green and dense environment. And so, for example, whenever we conduct activities with children, the children who receive small cedar trees because they are charismatic trees and they're linked to national identity, they are very happy. But if you give them an oak seedling instead of a cedar tree, the children who receive oak seedlings are upset and they are sad because they see it as a lower value tree specimen. So we have a very a big issue, which is I call it the British syndrome and the National Geographic syndrome. You know, all this new generation and the expectations of the scientists are this. Um, and this is international messages that we receive, you know, and the terms biodiversity and all these complex terms that are used by the global community, when you want to translate them locally, they mean nothing. Literally, they mean nothing, because also the translation into Arabic comes by someone sitting in I don't know which office, and then they translate the word because in Arabic it makes sense, but in life it doesn't make sense. And so you cannot even communicate issues. You cannot communicate, if you cannot communicate issues, you cannot solve issues. And issues can only be solved through participatory processes. And so if I want to think about a problem, I would, in the case of Lebanon, I think it would be, and maybe also many Arab countries, this international top-down terms and concepts and information where at the bottom of the translation you receive the final essence. I just want to end up with one example. During one period about 15 years ago, one of the things that became important was to assess biodiversity. You know, how do you assess biodiversity? It will take forever to assess biodiversity. The terms are easy, and then when you tell people that it's easy to do, but to actually implement and to comprehend the value of all of this into your daily life, when you have war, when you have economic struggle, it really makes you feel like nature and the environment is a luxury. And then you say, I'm going to leave it to the experts. And how many experts do you have in the country? 5, 10, 20? And so this is where you get abandonment from the society as a whole.
Thank you, Salma. Zena, would you like to close it before we go to audience questions?
Yeah, thank you. I won't speak for too long, but I just want to say how impressed I am by the quality of this discussion. It's, as I've said, this isn't my, forest fires aren't my particular area of expertise, so I feel like in many ways I'm learning a great deal through and said. I won't dwell on it too long. Flag, partly because Diana brought it up earlier in the conversation and triggered my memory again when she talked about the eucalyptus, is a lot of the trees in the forest that are in contemporary Israel, historic Palestine, were deliberately planted there as native erasure. The landscape very deliberately manipulated and controlled to plant, quite literally plant over the remnants of the Nakba, the loss of the Palestinian homeland in 1948. This was often done by organizations such as the Jewish National Fund and others, and the aim was very simple. It was to essentially make it impossible for Palestinians to find and identify with the landscape that was once theirs. And frequently they were sort of non-native species that they planted, and that has also had a huge sort of environmental impact on the landscape. So I just wanted to flag that as as a really important part of this story, I suppose. But yeah, put simply, this is a really clear case of profit and power over people. And as usual, it's always the most vulnerable who feel it the most. And I think if we look at Gaza in particular, this is a very apparent issue. Palestinians in Gaza are undoubtedly, the most vulnerable to Israel's the Israeli occupation and the Israeli siege, which has been going on for about 13 years now. Quite apart from not enough clean water entering the Gaza Strip, Israel also hinders any attempt to build or maintain water infrastructure. So, reservoirs or restricting imports of key materials, building materials. And the results are actually, quite apart from being environmentally catastrophic, they're deadly. This is a matter of life or death. 90 to 95% of all the water in Gaza is contaminated and is unfit for drinking or for irrigation. Contaminated water accounts for about 26% of all reported diseases in Gaza. It's a leading cause of child mortality. About 12% of all child deaths can be traced to contaminated water. So this is no longer, a sort of hypothetical of like when climate change starts to bite. This is actually a here and now combination of, aquifers being depleted because of over extraction and rising sea levels, which is a human and climate and sort of an effect of climate change and policy intersecting, and then a very clear policy response, which is to deprive Palestinians of the most basic resources. And the last thing I want to say is, I sort of had, when I was thinking about this question, it's very easy to wax lyricals or to think of actually fire as metaphor in a lot of these instances. Palestinians have used fire in the past as a means of resistance. Israeli settlers, and quite frequently use fire, particularly of Palestinian olive groves, as a way of intimidation, harassment, and violence. And I think if you see fire in that context, it actually has quite a kind of philosophical understanding in contemporary discourse. Olive groves comprise about 85.3% of all the trees in the occupied Palestinian territories. The olive sector contributes about 50% of total agricultural income. And culturally, sort of agriculture holds a very deep symbolism in Palestinian identity. The farmer, the fallahi, is sort of, the symbol of Palestinians' rootedness to the land. And so the perpetual and very violent burning of these 1,000-year-old olive groves by settlers in the West Bank has not just a sort of environmental effect, but also has a very profound cultural impact as well. And so I think that's kind of just where I'd leave my remarks. Thank you.
Thank you all so much. This has been such a rich conversation, and we have multiple audience questions. I'm hoping our panelists are able to stay a little bit past the hour, potentially, to answer some of them.
For a couple of minutes, yeah.
Yes, we can stay for just 5 minutes over. We'll start with a question going a little bit back to the property regimes. We had a question. Can you speak about how property regimes like state, local, private ownership pose challenges for forest management in your particular context? And maybe we can just take one or two answers to that, if anyone wants to jump on it.
I'm always willing to talk, but if you guys have something
why don't you go ahead and
say.
Why don't you go ahead and go for it, Diana?
Well, so I have two different short things to say, and one is that if you look historically, especially from the colonial period forwards, and we see some of this in Israel-Palestine, the planting of forests is often used to claim land and to assert a private ownership over a previously communal ownership situation. And I believe, reading Shaul Cohen's work, that this was done in Israel-Palestine, even in the Mandate period, to claim land away from what had previously been used as a herding, grazing environment. And here in California, it's really, really interesting that firefighters, I work with some colleagues, excuse me, who have done some interviews regarding, the fire situation. And they've interviewed some firefighters, and firefighters say, we always look for grazed land to set up our base of operations because the grazed land is so resistant to the spread of fire. And where do we see grazed land in California? Well, you can actually look at the property regimes and locate it pretty quickly because the privately owned land that is used by ranchers or other forms of herders to graze animals has the most fire resistance and the less frequent fires. You can actually map it out. And when you look at California state-owned land and county-owned land, the counties are starting to get on board with grazing and other forms of vegetation management for reduction of fire hazard. But you can't often do prescribed burns because the wind might be too high, the air pollution might be too high. Anyway, it's a complicated process here in California. But you can graze almost anywhere. So it's interesting that you see the higher you go up the chain of property ownership, the less grazing you see. So we see the least grazing, I think I am accurate, I'd have to go double check some statistics, but the least grazing in the federally owned forests or federally owned lands here in California. Now that doesn't hold true at Point Reyes National Seashore because that's a dairying area and there's an awful lot of grazing out there, so that's a different environment. But that's what I would have to add to that.
Thank you. Does anyone else want to chime in before we go to another question? Okay, we can move on. So we have a question from Jordan, who's at UC Santa Barbara. Jordan comments that something that strikes me from this discussion is how prolific the phenomenon of fire suppression has been around the world. It seems like that is an effective means of disenfranchising communities from non-market-based livelihoods. I would love to hear about how we can account for such a widespread phenomenon. In other words, is fire suppression a logical tool of coercive capitalism? And how can integrating local fire knowledge into land management be a way of decolonizing landscapes or empowering communities? So if anyone would love to speak on that.
I can say, I don't know, in the case of Lebanon specifically, I don't know if the practices were intended, definitely they were not intended to suppress fire in Lebanon. I mean, the practices were to keep people away from wooded areas. And so the fire suppression came at a later stage when the city started establishing closer and closer to woodlands. So all of a sudden, a nature that was an asset became a threat. And so I think what is important is that nature should not be considered as an exclusive luxury. Access to it, its management and its use, especially in areas such as the Mediterranean, where nature has only the nature that exists today in the Mediterranean is because of people's intervention and the high biodiversity that exists, which is one, and we are in the biodiversity hotspot. The high biodiversity that we have is due to the human intervention and the management of the resources. And so I think fire suppression, excluding people from using and managing the resources, will limit access to these forests to very few specialists, instead of it allowing a larger component of society to feel concerned and to feel equipped and emotionally willing to suppress, to control fires, to protect the resources.
Thank you, Salma. Others?
I just want to say it's a fantastic question, and the answer is long and complicated, so maybe we should wait until the end. You said maybe there would be more discussion at the very end, but it's an excellent question, Jordan. I'm glad you brought it up.
Zena, do you have anything you want to say around kind of like decolonizing landscapes?
Oh yeah, I have a lot to say about decolonizing landscapes. But I also was really impressed by the quality of the question. Yeah, I mean, the thing with the Palestine-Israel case of settler colonialism is very, it's not unique by any stretch, but it's very marked and it's been very well researched and very well documented. And I think part of the the challenge that Palestinians are facing today is actually how do they understand decolonization? And if I can just in a minute perhaps try and condense what a lot of the thinking centers around is the question is sort of how do you turn land from settler to native? You know, what does that's kind of, if we were to understand decolonization in that way, what does that look like? And there are Palestinian scholars, artists, geographers who are really grappling with that question. Dr. Salman Abu Sitta here in London has produced a very complicated and very detailed map of Palestine, Israel, and shown that around 80% of the land that was depopulated in 1948 has actually not been repopulated, and that includes my father's village, which is currently a kibbutz. And I think it just sort of goes to show that actually the way that we understand land is sort of you know, the foundational moment of colonialism, sort of drawing a line in the sand as to what how Palestinians can understand space is not a fixed meaning by any sense. And so I think you know, it's not directly related to the question, but I think there is a really rich discourse and a really rich discussion to be had about what does decolonization mean in settler colonial contexts.
Gabby, can I add something?
Yeah, please.
So I do hope we can circle back to this at the very end when we're done with the other questions. But let me just say there's something hopeful, I think, going on in California where the indigenous knowledge and wisdom of what they call good fire, burning small fires regularly, is actually starting to be taken quite seriously at the state level. And I believe they're starting to study that and even have some of our native peoples in as consultants. And I find that extremely hopeful. But grazing goes hand in hand with burning, and part of landscape decolonization has to include knowledge decolonization. So I hope maybe if we circle back to that, we could talk about those sorts of issues in more detail. Jordan must be doing a great dissertation down there in Santa Cruz.
Yeah. And I just wanted to say, because we're going to probably run out of time for our panelists, we actually are going to transition into the last questions here, but a couple ways you can stay in touch. First of all, actually, we had so much interest in this topic and other speakers that we couldn't fit today because of time differences, that we are hopefully going to be doing a part 2 and having people come in from Australia, actually some of our colleagues, Diana at Davis, who are working on indigenous fire management in California, Turkey, and so some of these questions actually will be a wonderful jumping off point for a hopeful part 2, which we're hoping to do either this month or next month. Additionally, we would really love to stay in touch with all of our attendees today. And right now, MK and Arab Studies Institute is putting into the chat on Zoom the various ways you can follow us on social media to hear about part 2, to get emails announcing upcoming events, etc. So just for the sake of today's schedule, I want to transition into the last question that actually 2 people asked. This is from Sarah and Hinge, so thank you. About hope, what you were just talking about, Diana. Amidst all this bleak news, what signs of hope do you see on the horizon? What is being done about it? What, from a policy perspective or, you know, a collective grassroots perspective, could be done around climate change, wildfires, capitalism, and colonialism? You don't have to answer for the whole world, but you can speak maybe from your context or what's been hopeful for you. And anyone who wants to start with the good news is welcome to chime in.
I'll happily just say a few words. Not too much makes me hopeful on the environmental front. Actually, I think we have a really long way to go in the Palestine-Israel context. But what does make me hopeful actually is the global shift of discourse around Palestine-Israel, particularly in the West. You know, what we're seeing in the US now is a re-embracing of the Palestinian movement as a progressive issue. In the past, we've had what's called PEP, Progressive Except for Palestine, and we're starting to see that shifting and kind of challenging those assumptions. And my hope and what is starting to happen is actually embracing Palestine and, you know, decolonial struggle into the fold of environmental movements worldwide. So that for me would be the biggest hope.
Thank you, Zena.
I think, again, I only speak for my experience in Lebanon. I think the hope that even with the youth, which we kept saying for years that they are the digital generation, I find that the more there is political unrest and the more there is economic strife and difficulties, I find that the youth are driven more and more towards nature and the environment and ecological practices. It's like they are finding that their future lies in their well-being, and they're recognizing the importance of them taking charge of their own future. So despite everything that's happening in Lebanon, I see this major change. You know, I've been teaching for almost 30 years, and the last 5 to 10 years have been very different in terms of the youth attitude towards nature and towards eco-citizenship.
Thank you. Diana?
Well, one thing that gives me a great deal of hope is I'm starting to see editorials, excuse me, in major science magazines and even in the New York Times saying, planting more trees can't save the planet, and things like this. So that's trying to bring it to the public attention. But, you know, the deep psychological roots of arborocentrism are so strong and so unrecognized in most people's brains. They don't even know that they've been raised with this ideology of arborocentrism. That just 5 years ago, a climate scientist wrote a New York Times editorial, in fact, with a very similar title, and she received death threats because people couldn't believe that she was questioning the value of planting trees. And I just finished a piece where I quote a scientist who reports overhearing other scientists say things like, well, if my data showed that forests and planting trees don't cool the planet, I would refuse to publish it. So I'm hopeful on one level, but I'm still very concerned on another level. And I think more public discussion about, you know, the strengths, but also the drawbacks of planting trees everywhere needs to continue. And that's why I think this forum has been so fantastic. It's brought up really important questions from all over the world. And what we need is more open discussion about these and friendly discussion and friendly debate. Not everyone agrees on everything, and that's okay, but we learn from each other, right? That's where the hope is for me. Thank you.
Well, I think that that has just really summarized, all three of you, what has been so powerful about today is the way that we've been able to discuss, debate, unpack the environmental, ecological, scientific side, and also political, social, cultural issues related to fires, grasslands, capitalism, goats. We really covered a lot of ground around the world. So I just wanted to just send the sincerest thanks, Salma, Zena, Diana. You took time out of your busy days. We had a lot of time zone calculations across multiple hemispheres, and I just really can't thank you enough. I also, it would not be the same without all of the attendees here who made this conversation what it was. And again, huge thanks to MK Smith, Kylie Broderick, Bassam Haddad, who was really the one that told us we had to do this in the first place. And of course, Owen Lawson and Graham Pitts, my colleagues who put so much work into organizing this panel. Stay tuned for a part 2. We would love to hear from you in the interim. Please follow us on social media. If you're not on social media, we do old school emails. And I'm sure the panelists would love to hear from you. You can see their bios again and read their publications to learn more about these topics. So just thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful day. If it's morning where you are, have a wonderful evening. If it's evening where you are, stay safe and healthy and in struggle as best as you can. So thank everyone so much for being here today.
Okay. Good night.
Thank you.
Bye.
Good night.
Thank you.
Good night, good evening, good day.
It's that Truman Show thing. Good morning, good afternoon, good night.
Yes, exactly, it's exactly that. But like we live in the, Zoom is living in the Truman Show
It's
nowadays.
so real.
Oh my gosh.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.